The job posting didn't use the phrase other place. It used the term anomalous displacement experience. A phrase so clinical and so deliberately imprecise that it communicated nothing useful to someone who didn't already know what it meant and communicated everything necessary to someone who did. The government has a long history of naming things in ways that simultaneously acknowledge their existence and deny their significance. Anomalous displacement experience was a masterpiece of that tradition. It named the thing. It put the thing in a category. And the category was named in a way that made the thing sound like a filing error rather than what it actually was. What it actually was I will get to. My name is Dr. Lena Park. Psychologist. 15 years of clinical practice with a subspecialty in trauma-adjacent conditions, the specific category of psychological presentations that develop not from standard trauma but from experiences that the standard trauma framework was not built to accommodate. Experiences that don't fit the existing diagnostic architecture. Experiences that the literature describes, with the specific careful language of people trying not to say something alarming, as outside the expected range of human experience. I had published 2 papers on anomalous experience and psychological integration. I had not expected those papers to land me a government contract. I had written them because the gap in the clinical literature bothered me the way gaps bother people who have spent long enough in a field to understand what the gaps mean. The gaps mean someone decided not to look. The contract came from an agency whose name I signed an NDA agreeing not to disclose and that I will refer to throughout this account as the program. The program had been operating for 11 years. Its purpose, as described in the contract documentation, was the systematic psychological assessment of individuals who had reported anomalous displacement experiences, a population of several hundred people, distributed across the country, each of whom had at some point reported to hospital, law enforcement, or other institutional contact that they had been in a place that was not the place they were supposed to be. Not a different location. A different place entirely. The other place. I will describe what the other place was, insofar as 11 months of interviews have given me the ability to describe it, in the parts of this account that follow. What I will say here, at the beginning, is that the description is not mine. I did not go to the other place. I interviewed the people who did. 53 of them across 11 months. And what I will give you is the shape that emerges when you listen to 53 people try to describe the same thing from 53 different angles. Not a composite. Not an average. The shape. The program's facility was in Maryland. A converted administrative building on the edge of a campus I was not cleared to know the full extent of. My workspace was a suite of 3 rooms, an interview room, an observation room connected to the interview room by one-way glass, and an office where I processed the session recordings and produced the assessment documentation that the program required. The program had been doing assessments before I arrived. My predecessor, a man named Dr. Osei who had left the position 8 months before my hire and whom I was told had departed for personal reasons, had produced 14 months of documentation before his departure. The documentation was in the files when I arrived. I read all of it before my first interview. Dr. Osei's documentation was thorough and precise in the way that careful clinical work is thorough and precise. His session notes covered 41 subjects across 14 months. His assessment framework was sound. His clinical interpretations were measured and defensible. And then in the final 2 months of his documentation something changed. Not in the rigor. Not in the methodology. In the quality of the language. The specific way that clinical language changes when the clinician is no longer fully behind the framework they are using. When the framework is still being applied because the framework is what there is but the person applying it has begun to doubt whether the framework fits what it is being applied to. In his final session notes Dr. Osei had started writing things in the margins. Not clinical observations. Personal ones. The kind of thing that belongs in a private journal rather than a professional assessment document. Brief. Often fragmentary. As if they were arriving while he was writing the official notes and he was recording them before they left. The margin notes were the first thing that told me the work was different from what the contract documentation had described. The last margin note in the file, in the final session document, 2 weeks before Osei's departure, was 4 words. They are not wrong. I read that 4 times before I moved to the first interview. My first subject was a man named Thomas. 47. Former electrician. He had reported his anomalous displacement experience to an emergency room in Ohio 3 years ago. The ER had referred him to psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatric evaluation had resulted in a brief hospitalization and then discharge with a diagnosis of dissociative episode and a prescription that he had stopped taking after 6 months because, as he told me in our first session, the medication made the memory of the other place less clear and he did not want it less clear. Why not? I said. He looked at me with the specific quality of someone who has been asked this question before and has decided whether the person asking it is someone who can receive the answer. Because if I forget it, he said, then there's no one left who remembers what it was like. Tell me what it was like, I said. He looked at his hands. You're going to write it in a file, he said. Yes, I said. And what happens to the file, he said. It goes into the program's documentation, I said. It's reviewed by the program's assessment team. And then, he said. I don't know what happens after that, I said honestly. My role is the assessment. What the program does with the assessments is above my clearance level. He nodded slowly. The nod of someone who expected that answer and is deciding whether it disqualifies the conversation. No one has asked me why I don't want to forget it, he said. The other doctors. They asked about the experience itself. The symptoms. The integration. Whether I could function normally. They never asked why I wanted to remember. Why do you? I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Because someone should, he said. Because there was something there. In the other place. And if everyone who went there either forgets it or is medicated into not caring about the memory, then it's like it never happened. And it happened. Whatever it was, it happened. Tell me, I said. He told me. I listened. And by the end of the first session I understood why Dr. Osei had written 4 words in the margin of his final assessment and left. I just didn't know yet whether I was going to do the same thing. By the end of the 3rd month I had interviewed 19 subjects. 19 people who had been to the other place and had come back and had been routed through whatever institutional channels eventually produced a referral to the program and who sat across from me in the interview room and tried to describe something for which none of them had adequate language. The inadequacy of the language was itself the first consistent finding. Not surprising in clinical terms, individuals describing experiences outside the standard range of human experience routinely struggle with description. The framework of description is built from the framework of experience, and when the experience falls outside the framework, the description follows. Standard presentations of anomalous experience are often fragmentary, metaphor-heavy, and internally inconsistent in ways that reflect the limits of language rather than the limits of recall. What was unusual about the other place descriptions was the specific quality of the inadequacy. With standard anomalous presentations, the subject struggled because the experience was confusing or frightening or both, and the struggle to describe it reflects the struggle to understand it. The description is an attempt to make sense of something that didn't make sense. The other place subjects were not trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. They were trying to describe something they understood with a precision that their available language could not carry. That distinction took me 3 months to fully articulate, and it is the most important finding in my 11 months of work. They knew what they had seen. They could not say it. I will give you the shape that emerged across 53 interviews. Not the details of any individual account, those belong to the people who gave them and to the assessment documentation, but the shape. The consistent structure that appeared, whether the subject was Thomas the electrician from Ohio or a retired school teacher from Vermont or a 19-year-old college student from Seattle who had been hiking alone when it happened and had been found 2 days later sitting at the edge of the trailhead looking at nothing with an expression that her friends had described as not frightened but different. The same expression, in different words, in nearly every account. Not frightened. Different. The other place was not dark. This was among the most consistent descriptors across all 53 accounts and also the one that subjects returned to most frequently as if it required repeated emphasis. Not dark. It did not have the quality of a nightmare space, the horror movie darkness that people reach for when they are trying to communicate that a place was frightening. It was lit. In a way that no subject could adequately source, not by any visible light source, not by sunlight or artificial light or any light-producing mechanism. Simply lit. As if the light was a property of the space rather than a product of something within it. Several subjects used the phrase "it knew it was supposed to be light and so it was." I noted that phrase the first time it appeared, in Thomas's account in month 1. By month 4 I had encountered it, in slightly different formulations, in 11 separate accounts from subjects who had no contact with each other and no access to each other's descriptions. The other place had the light that a place should have without the mechanism that produces it. The other place was large. Not uniformly. Not in the simple spatial sense of a room with walls far apart. Large in a way that several subjects described as variable, large when approached and different when within. The sense that the space's dimensions were not fixed. That proximity changed not just perspective but actuality. A subject from Arizona described it as a place that was exactly as large as you needed it to be and not larger, and this precision haunted me because every other subject had described something that corresponded to it without using those words. The other place contained things. This was the area of greatest variation across the accounts. Not all subjects described the same contents. The specific objects and features and presences that subjects reported varied significantly, different enough that the program's previous assessment framework had used the variation to classify subjects' experiences as distinct episodes rather than a single shared phenomenon. Dr. Osei had challenged this classification in his documentation. He had been overruled. The classification was wrong. I understood by month 5 why it was wrong and why Osei had challenged it and why his challenge had been overruled. The variation in described contents was the variation of a place that was different for different visitors, not because it was different places but because the place was responsive. It gave each visitor what was appropriate to that visitor specifically. Not what they wanted. What was appropriate. The distinction, as I understood it through 53 accounts, was significant. Several subjects described finding things in the other place that they had not wanted to find. Things they had not known they needed to find. One woman described finding her father there, her father who had died when she was 12 and with whom she had never resolved a specific wound from childhood, a specific failure of his, a specific hurt that she had carried for 37 years and had organized her emotional life around without fully knowing she was doing it. She had not wanted to find him. She had not known she needed to. But in the other place he was there, and the conversation that followed was the conversation 37 years overdue, and it had happened and she had come back without the wound. Not healed. Without. As if it had been removed rather than mended. She had described this to the ER physician who had first assessed her as the most important thing that had ever happened to her, and the physician had noted it as a possible delusion of significance and referred her on. Thomas the electrician had found something different. He had found a place in the other place, a specific location within it, where he had sat for what felt like a long time and had understood something about the nature of time itself. Not intellectually. Not through information received or instruction given. Through direct apprehension. The way you understand a smell, without processing, without mediation, the understanding arriving complete. He could not describe what he had understood. This was the most consistent finding across all 53 accounts. Whatever the subjects had understood in the other place, and they were uniform in their insistence that they had understood something, something specific, something they could not adequately describe, they could not bring the full understanding back. They brought back the knowledge that they had understood something. Not the understanding itself. The closest any subject got to describing this was a woman named Sarah. 32. Graduate student in physics at the time of her experience. 2 years from her experience when I interviewed her. She described it as returning from a dream where you knew the language and waking into a world where that language doesn't exist and having only the grammar of the dream and none of the words. The grammar, she said, was enough to know the words had existed. Not enough to say them. The other place had presences. Not all subjects described them. 31 of 53 did. The presences varied in form. Some subjects described vague peripheral sensations of non-aloneness, others described specific figures, specific forms. One subject described something he could not visualize but that he felt the weight of the way you feel the weight of a person in a room with you before you see them. The presences were consistent in one quality across all 31 accounts. They were not alarmed by the subject's arrival. They had been expecting them. Not in a threatening sense. Not in the sense of something waiting to harm. In the sense of something that knew they were coming and had made whatever preparation was appropriate and was simply present for the arrival. Several subjects described the presences as attending. That word. That specific word. Attending. In the full sense of it, present, focused, engaged, patient. I noted it the first time. By month 7 I had noted it in 9 separate accounts. The other places' presences attended the subjects. And the subjects, even the ones who had been frightened on arrival, even the ones whose initial response to the other place had been disoriented and distressing, uniformly described feeling attended to as one of the most significant experiences of their lives. Attended to by something that had always known they were coming. That had always known them. Now I will tell you the finding that I have not included in any of the official assessment documentation. The finding I have been carrying alone since month 6. 31 subjects described presences. Of those 31, when I asked specific questions about the quality of the presences, when I moved beyond the standard assessment framework into territory that the framework had not been designed to cover, 22 of them described something consistent. The presences knew things about the subjects that the subjects had not told them. Not general things. Specific things. The kind of interior, private, intimate things that constitute the self that is not shown to the world. Not the public self. The private one. The one that exists in the specific combination of memory and hope and regret and the particular texture of individual consciousness that makes a person irreducibly themselves. The presences knew them. Not because the subjects had communicated this information. Because the presences had always known. I sat with that finding for 2 months before I understood what it meant. And what it meant was why Dr. Osei had written they are not wrong in the margin of his final assessment. The subjects were not delusional. They were not experiencing dissociative episodes. They were not producing confabulated memories of an experience that had not occurred. They had been somewhere. And something there had known them. And known, with a specificity and a depth that exceeded any human knowledge of them, who they were. The question I could not answer from the assessment data alone was not whether the other place was real. By month 6 I was certain it was real. The question I could not answer was what it was. That answer came from the subject I interviewed in month 8. Subject 41. The one who was different from all the others in a specific way that I had not encountered in the previous 40 and that changed everything I thought I understood about the program and the other place and the reason the program existed. Subject 41 had not come back. Not fully. The file on Subject 41 arrived on my desk on a Monday morning in my 8th month with a routing notation I had not seen before. Every subject file I had received across 7 months carried the same routing header, a standard program intake classification and a case number and the basic biographical and referral information that preceded the assessment sessions. Routine. Consistent. Subject 41's file had an additional notation. A single line, added in red, beneath the standard header. Assessor note, exercise particular caution regarding session boundaries. Do not extend sessions beyond 60 minutes. Do not deviate from the standard assessment protocol. Report any protocol deviations immediately to program oversight. I had received caution notations before. Subjects with documented histories of psychological instability, subjects whose initial institutional contacts had involved risk assessments, subjects whose displacement experiences had produced particularly acute distress responses. Caution notations were not unusual. Red was unusual. I had not seen red before. I read the file. Subject 41 was a woman named Miriam. 51 years old. Former marine biologist, currently on extended leave from her research position. Her displacement experience had occurred 14 months ago on a research vessel in the Pacific Northwest. She had been conducting a solo dive, sanctioned, within parameters, the kind of routine deep-water survey she had done hundreds of times, and she had not surfaced on schedule. The crew had initiated emergency protocols. 47 minutes after her scheduled surface time, she had appeared at the vessel's stern ladder, gear intact, no visible distress, and had climbed aboard. The crew described her behavior in the immediate aftermath as calm. Not the relieved, shaken calm of someone who has survived an emergency. Calm in the way that the other subjects described the other place, not frightened. Different. She had not reported a displacement experience to the vessel's crew. She had completed the dive report. She had eaten dinner. She had gone to sleep. 3 weeks later, her research institution had referred her to the program. Not because she had reported anything. Because her colleagues had noticed something. I read the colleague reports carefully. They were not reports of distress or dysfunction. Miriam was functioning normally in every professional and personal metric. She was doing her work. She was meeting her obligations. She was eating and sleeping and maintaining her relationships. But something had changed. The colleagues described it in different ways. Her office neighbor said she had a quality now of paying attention that she had not had before. Not distraction, the opposite. A focused, patient, comprehensive attention to everything around her. As if she was listening to something that others could not hear. A graduate student described sitting in a meeting with her and feeling, with a certainty he could not explain, that she knew what he was thinking before he said it. Not in a frightening way. In the way that someone who understands you very well might know what you're about to say. But with a depth of understanding that his 8 months of working closely with her had not established. Her closest friend described a single incident. They had been walking together and the friend had been processing privately, silently, not yet ready to speak, a significant personal decision. Without any external indication, without any conversation leading toward it, Miriam had stopped walking and had looked at her and had said, "You already know what you're going to choose. You've known for 2 months. You're waiting for permission to know it out loud." The friend had stood on the sidewalk and cried. Because it was true. Because she had known for 2 months. Because nobody had ever said that to her before. I had been reading Miriam's file for 2 hours before I understood why the notation was in red. It was not a caution about Miriam. It was a caution about me. Something about Miriam's sessions required the assessor to maintain distance. Required the standard protocol rather than the extended engagement I had developed across 40 subjects. Required a 60-minute limit and immediate reporting of deviations. Because whatever Miriam had brought back from the other place, whatever the 47 minutes had given her or changed in her, it affected the people around her in ways that the program had identified as requiring management. I went to the program's oversight director. A man named Calloway who occupied a role in the program that I had never fully understood, part administrator, part researcher, part something that the organizational chart didn't have a category for. He was in his office when I knocked. "The file on 41, I said. "Yes," he said. "The red notation," I said. "Tell me what it's about." He looked at me for a moment. "Extended exposure to subject 41 produces effects in the exposed individual," he said. "The effects are not harmful. They are significant." "What effects?" I said. "The effects that subject 41's colleagues have described," he said. "Enhanced perception. Specifically, enhanced perception of other people. Of their interior states. Their private knowledge. Their unexpressed experience. She's transferring something," I said. "Extended proximity to her produces a version of what she experienced in the other place," he said. A partial version. A low-intensity version. But measurable. Measurable how? I said. The colleagues who spent the most time with her in the months after her return showed elevated scores on the standard empathy and social cognition assessments, he said. Significantly elevated. Beyond any range in the normative data. She's changing the people around her, I said. She's affecting them, he said. The distinction may matter. And the 60-minute session limit. I said. Below 60 minutes of sustained one-on-one contact with subject 41 the effect is minimal, he said. Above 60 minutes it becomes measurable. Above 90 minutes it becomes significant. You've tested this, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Dr. Osei conducted 3 sessions with subject 41 before his departure, he said. 2 within the 60-minute limit. 1 that extended to 97 minutes. What happened after the 97-minute session? I said. Dr. Osei began displaying the elevated empathy and social cognition scores, he said. He also began describing perceptual experiences that he had not previously described. He began perceiving what she perceives, I said. A version of it, he said. Is that why he left? I said. Calloway looked at his desk. Dr. Osei left because after the 97-minute session he found it very difficult to work within the program's standard framework, he said. The framework requires a particular kind of professional distance. It requires the assessor to maintain the role of observer. After the session with 41, Dr. Osei found the observer role increasingly untenable. Because he could feel what the subjects were describing, I said. Because he could feel what everyone around him was experiencing, he said. All the time. Without distance. The office was quiet. And you want me to assess her, I said. I want you to assess her within the stated parameters, he said. 60 minutes. Standard protocol. No deviations. You are the most rigorous assessor we have had in this position. I believe you can maintain the boundaries. Did you believe that about Dr. Osei? I said. He was quiet for a long moment. I believed it, he said. I was not correct. I went back to my office. I read the file again. All of it. The colleague reports. The institutional referral. The preliminary intake assessment conducted by a program staff member before the case reached me. Then I read the section of the file I had saved for last. The intake assessment's description of what Miriam herself had said about her experience. She had been more specific than most subjects. Less struggle with the language. Not because the experience was less difficult to describe, if anything her account was richer and more detailed than most, but because she had spent 14 months with what she had brought back and had developed, across those months, something closer to a vocabulary for it than the subjects who came to me earlier in their return. She described the other place as a space of complete knowledge. Not omniscience. Not the science fiction godlike knowing of everything simultaneously. Something more specific. Knowledge of persons. Complete, exact, irreducible knowledge of every individual who had ever been. There are presences there, she had told the intake assessor. And the presences know everyone who has ever existed. Not know about. Know. The way you know something that is part of you. The way you know your own name. What are the presences? The intake assessor had asked. I don't know what they are in the sense of what category they belong to, she had said. But I know what they do. They hold the knowledge of every person who has been. They keep it. So it's not lost. What would happen if it were lost? The assessor had asked. Miriam had been quiet for a long moment before answering. Something in the other place, she had said, is structured around not losing it. Everything there is oriented around that. The keeping of the knowledge. The preservation of the irreducible specificity of every person who has existed. Why? The assessor had asked. Because, she had said, it matters. Not instrumentally. Not because it is useful for something. It matters the way mattering matters. In itself. The fact of each person. The specific, particular, unrepeatable fact of each individual consciousness that has ever been. It matters and it is kept, and the keeping of it is what the other place is for. I sat with that for a long time. Then I scheduled the session with Miriam. For a Tuesday. 60 minutes. Standard protocol. I was 11 minutes into the session when I understood that the 60-minute limit and the standard protocol were not going to be adequate to what the session was. Not because Miriam was doing anything outside the standard framework. Because she looked at me when she sat down across the interview table and she said, with the specific quality of someone stating something that requires stating before anything else, "You've been carrying something for a very long time. Since before this work. Something you haven't shown anyone." She said it without preamble. Without warmth or coldness. With the specific quality of accurate statement. And she was right. And I knew she was right. And I knew what the red notation was trying to prevent. Not harm. The dissolution of the distance between assessor and subject that the program required for the assessments to be what the program needed them to be. The dissolution of the professional framework that made the work possible. The dissolution that Dr. Osei had experienced in 97 minutes and that I was beginning to experience in 11. I looked at Miriam across the table. She looked at me with the knowing quality that her colleagues had described. Patient. Complete. Without any of the social performance that human perception usually involves. Just the knowing. Just the attending. I looked at the clock on the wall. 49 minutes remaining. I made a decision in the 11 seconds after she spoke. Not the decision I should have made according to the program's protocols. The protocol decision would have been to redirect. To apply the standard framework. To say something professional and measured that acknowledged her statement without engaging it and moved the session toward the structured assessment questions that the program required. I made a different decision. Not impulsively. Not without awareness of what I was choosing. With the specific, clear-eyed awareness of someone who understands the cost of a decision before making it and makes it anyway because the alternative is a kind of dishonesty they are no longer willing to perform. "Tell me what you see," I said. Miriam looked at me for a moment. The quality of her attention was not what I had encountered in 40 previous subjects. Those subjects attended to me in the ordinary human sense, aware of me, responsive to me, present in the conversation with me. Miriam's attention was something different in kind rather than degree. Not more attentive. Attentive differently. As if the attention itself was operating at a different level of resolution. Seeing not the surface of things but the structure underneath. "You came to this work," she said, "because of something that happened before this work. Not a single event. A period. A specific period in your life when you were approximately 17 years old during which something occurred that produced in you the specific orientation you now have toward people who have had experiences that don't fit the standard frameworks." I did not say anything. "You recognized them," she said. "The people with the experiences that didn't fit. Not because you are one of them, you haven't been to the other place or anywhere adjacent to it. But because at 17 something happened to you that put you in proximity to a person who had, and the experience of being in proximity to that person changed your understanding of what the standard frameworks could and couldn't hold." I looked at the table. "Your mother," she said. Not a question. I looked up. "Your mother had an experience when you were 17 that she could not explain within any framework available to her," she said. "And the people she went to for help, the clinical people, the institutional people, did not have a framework for it either, and their response was to reduce it to something their frameworks could accommodate. And watching that reduction happen, watching something real be made smaller than it was by the people who were supposed to help, that is what you have been working against for 15 years. She said it plainly. Without drama. The way you say something that is simply accurate. "How do you know that?" I said. "I know it the way I've known everything since I came back," she said. Not because someone told me. Not because I inferred it. Because when I look at a person, I see them in the way that the presences in the other place see everyone. Not completely, I'm not there, I'm here, and what I brought back is a version rather than the thing itself. But enough. Enough to know what I haven't told anyone, I said. Enough to know what you haven't shown anyone, she said. There's a difference. You know what I'm describing. You've been studying it in your subjects for 8 months. The private self. The one that isn't shown. I can see it. In everyone. I said. In everyone I spend enough time with, she said. It was disorienting at first. The 14 months since I came back have been an adjustment. You learn to manage it the way you learn to manage any change in perception. You develop the ability to not look directly at it when looking directly is not what the situation requires. But you're looking directly at me, I said. Because the situation requires it, she said. Because you're the first assessor I've talked to who I think can receive what I need to tell you. What do you need to tell me? I said. She looked at her hands for a moment. A human gesture in the midst of everything else that wasn't quite human anymore. The specific, ordinary gesture of someone gathering themselves before saying something significant. The program, she said. What do you understand its purpose to be? Assessment, I said. Psychological assessment of displacement experience subjects. Assessment in the service of what, she said. I thought about the documentation I produced. The files that went to the program's assessment team. The next stage of the process that was above my clearance level and that I had never been invited to know more about. I don't know, I said honestly. The program has been operating for 11 years, she said. In 11 years it has assessed hundreds of subjects. Produced thousands of pages of documentation. What has been done with that documentation? I don't know, I said again. Dr. Osei tried to find out, she said. In the weeks after his session with me. Before he left. He spent those weeks trying to understand what the program was for. What the assessments were building toward. What the hundreds of files of documentation about people who had been to the other place were being used to do. What did he find? I said. He found enough to leave, she said. He didn't find everything. He found the direction. What direction? I said. She looked at me with the full quality of her knowing attention. The other place, she said, is what the presences I described know the fact of every person. Where the irreducible specificity of every individual consciousness is kept. Preserved. Because it matters. Yes, I said. The program has been producing detailed psychological assessments of the people who have been there, she said. Detailed documentation of their interior lives. Their private selves. The specific, irreducible facts of who they are. I looked at the table. The program is mapping them, I said slowly. The program is producing the most detailed psychological portraits of specific individuals that any institution has ever produced, she said. Using the access that the displacement experience gives. Using the fact that people who have been to the other place are more accessible, more transparent, than people who haven't. Their experience has made them more open. More willing to describe the private self. More capable of it. And the documentation goes, I said. To people who want to understand what the other place knows, she said. Who want to understand the system by which the presences know the persons. Who want to replicate it. Not to keep the knowledge the way the presences keep it, as an act of care, because the fact of each person matters, but to have it. To possess it. To hold the specific, private, irreducible information of hundreds of people who have been somewhere that ordinary privacy doesn't reach. The interview room was very quiet. They're not assessing us, I said. They're harvesting us. The assessment is real, she said. The psychological evaluation is genuine and the assessors are acting in good faith. You are acting in good faith. But the purpose it serves is not what the contract documentation describes. How do you know this? I said. Because I have read Calloway, she said. Every time I'm in proximity to him. The way I read everyone. The way I read you. He knows what the program is for and he believes in it, and what he believes in is the acquisition of the knowledge the other place has. Not its preservation. Its acquisition. I thought about Calloway's face when he described Dr. Osei's session. The careful neutrality of someone describing something they have a specific relationship to that they are not disclosing. The presences, I said. In the other place. The ones who know everyone. They attend to the subjects who arrive. They don't alarm them. They are expected the arrivals. Yes, she said. And the program documents the subjects who return, I said. Detailed documentation of their interior lives. Their private selves. Information the subjects provide because the experience has made them more open. Yes, she said. And the program is trying to understand how the presences know what they know, I said. So they can replicate it. Without the care. Without the orientation toward preservation, because the fact of each person matters. Yes, she said. That's what Dr. Osei understood, I said. That's what he was beginning to understand, she said. He left before he had the full picture. I don't think he had the full picture when he left. What is the full picture? I said. She looked at me for a long moment. The presences in the other place know everyone who has ever been, she said. Everyone. Not just the ones who arrived there. Not just the ones who were displaced and found themselves in that space. Everyone who has ever existed. Every consciousness that has ever been real. How? I said. Because the other place is adjacent to everything, she said. Not adjacent in the spatial sense. Adjacent in the way that the substrate of a thing is adjacent to the thing. Not beside it. Underneath it. Foundational to it. I had heard that before. In other accounts. In the language that the subject struggled to find. The quality of the other place as something underneath rather than beside. The other place is the foundation, I said. It is where the fact of every person is held, she said. Not after. Not only after. Continuously. The knowing of every person that the presences do is not retrospective. It is not the knowing of what someone was. It is the knowing of what someone is. Right now. Every person alive and every person who has been. The knowing is continuous. I held that. It knows me, I said. It has always known you, she said. It has always known everyone in this building. In this city. Everyone. And the program wants to replicate that, I said. The knowing. The continuous, complete, foundational knowing. The program wants to understand the mechanism, she said. It has been using the subjects, the people who have been there, who have experienced proximity to that knowing, who carry traces of it, to reverse engineer the mechanism. To understand how a continuous, complete knowledge of every person is structured and maintained. In order to build one, I said. In order to build something that does what it does without what it is, she said. The presences keep the knowledge because the fact of each person matters. The program wants the knowledge without the mattering. The capacity without the care. She looked at me directly. That is the full picture, she said. That is why Dr. Osei left. Not because he couldn't manage the effects of the session. Because he understood what the documentation he had been producing was being used for and could not continue producing it. I looked at the clock. 51 minutes. 9 minutes remaining in the standard session window. Miriam, I said. What do you want me to do? She looked at me with the complete, patient, non-performing attention that she had looked at me with since she sat down. I want you to understand something first, she said. Something about yourself. Tell me, I said. The thing you have been carrying since before this work, she said. Since your mother's experience when you were 17. The wound that came from watching something real be made smaller by the people who were supposed to help. You have spent 15 years trying to correct that. Trying to be the person who doesn't make it smaller. Who holds the full size of it? Yes, I said. You have been doing that here, she said. In this work. Despite the program's purpose, which you didn't know and were not responsible for, you have been doing the thing you have always done. You have been sitting with 53 people who experience something real, and you have been receiving that reality at its full size. Not reducing it. I did not say anything. Your assessments, she said, are the most accurate records of what the other place is that this program has produced. Not because of what the program will do with them. Because of what you were doing when you produced them. You were listening in the way it is necessary to listen. In the way the presences listen. With the orientation of care rather than acquisition. What does that mean for what I do now? I said. She looked at me for a moment. It means, she said, that you have a choice. And the choice is one that Dr. Osei did not fully understand he had when he left. He understood enough to go. He did not understand enough to know what going should produce. What should it produce? I said. She looked at the clock. 3 minutes. The records, she said. Your assessments. 53 subjects. 11 months of the most accurate documentation of what the other place is and what it does to the people who go there that has ever been produced. That documentation exists. What happens to it is not yet determined. The program has copies, I said. Everything I produced has gone to the program's archives. Yes, she said. But you have the original understanding. The understanding that produced them. The program has the documentation. You have what the documentation came from. The clock hit 60 minutes. The session timer on the room's monitoring system chimed softly. Standard end of session. Miriam looked at the clock. Then back at me. You know what to do, she said. Not a statement of certainty about my future choices. The statement of someone who, in 60 minutes of complete and foundational knowing, had seen exactly who I was. And was reflecting it back. I sat in my office for 3 hours after the session with Miriam. Not processing the session in the clinical sense. Not producing the assessment documentation that the program required within 24 hours of each interview. Not doing any of the work that the work required. Just sitting. With the specific quality of someone who has arrived at a point they have been moving toward without knowing they were moving toward it, and who needs the sitting to understand that they have arrived. The session had ended at 60 minutes. I had maintained the boundary. Calloway, reviewing the monitoring records, would see a 60-minute session conducted within the standard protocol parameters. No deviation. No red flag documentation required. What the monitoring records would not show was what 60 minutes with Miriam had done. Not the dramatic dissolution that Calloway had feared. Not the 97-minute transformation that had made Dr. Osei unable to maintain the observer role. Something more precise than that. Something more useful. Clarity. The specific, cold, organizing clarity of someone who has had something named accurately for the first time. The kind of clarity that doesn't produce emotion immediately, that produces stillness first, the stillness of a system that has just received information that will require significant reorganization and has paused before the reorganization begins. I thought about my mother. I had not thought about my mother in a professional context in 15 years. I had compartmentalized with the efficiency that clinical training produces, not suppression, not avoidance, the professional management of personal material in contexts where personal material was not appropriate. I had understood since graduate school that my orientation toward anomalous experience had a personal history. I had understood it the way you understand things when you have processed them sufficiently to function with them rather than against them. Miriam had not told me anything I didn't know. She had told me something I knew in a way that I had never heard it said aloud. The difference between knowing something and having it named in the presence of another person who sees it clearly is not a small difference. It is the difference between carrying something alone and being seen carrying it. The weight doesn't change. The carrying changes. I thought about my mother's experience when I was 17. What she had described. What the clinical people had done with what she described. How the specific, real, unrepeatable thing that had happened to her had been processed through a framework that made it smaller because the framework had no room for the full size of it. I thought about 15 years of trying to be the person who didn't make it smaller. I thought about 53 subjects across 11 months. And I thought about what Miriam had told me the documentation was being used for. Not assessment in the service of understanding. Assessment in the service of acquisition. The detailed psychological portraits of 53 people who had been to the other place, who had experienced proximity to a knowledge that held the irreducible specificity of every person with care, being used to reverse engineer that knowledge. To build a version of it without the care. Without the orientation that the other place's presences had. Without the foundational commitment to the fact of each person mattering. The mechanism without the mattering. I opened my office computer. I opened the assessment database. I looked at the documentation I had produced across 11 months. Not the surface of it, the clinical language and the assessment frameworks and the structured reports that the program had been archiving and analyzing and using for their purpose. The depth of it. The specific, careful, full-size record of 53 people who had been somewhere extraordinary and had come back carrying something they couldn't fully say and had tried to say it anyway to a person who was listening. I had listened. And what I had heard, the real content of the interviews, the thing underneath the clinical language, the full understanding that my documentation approximated but did not completely contain, was in me. Miriam had said it correctly. The program had the documentation. I had what the documentation came from. I had been the person who didn't make it smaller. For 11 months. 53 times. I had held the full size of it. And now I had to decide what to do with the holding. I thought about Dr. Osei. He had left. He had understood enough to go. He had not understood, according to Miriam, what going should produce. He had taken his departure and his personal knowledge and his margin notes and his forewords, they are not wrong, and he had gone somewhere the program couldn't follow and he had not done anything further with what he had understood. Not because he was wrong to leave. Because leaving without acting was only half of what the situation required. I understood what the other half was. I opened a new document. Not the program's assessment template. A blank document. The kind you start when you are writing something that does not have a pre-existing form because the thing you are writing has not been written before. I began to write. Not the clinical language. Not the assessment framework. The plain language of someone who has listened to 53 people describe the same extraordinary thing and has understood it and is now going to say what they understood as clearly and fully and honestly as they can. I wrote for 6 hours. What I wrote was this account. Not exactly this account, the account I was writing then was the first draft of something that has gone through many versions in the months since. But the core of it. The shape of what I had understood. What the other place was. What the presences were. What the knowledge was and how it was held and why it was held. What the program was doing. What the documentation was being used for. And what the 53 people who had been there had experienced and what it had done to them and what it meant that every single one of them, even the ones who had been frightened, even the ones who had been disoriented, even the ones whose return had been difficult and whose integration had been incomplete, had described the knowing of the presences as the most significant experience of their lives. Not frightening. Significant. The experience of being known completely and held with care because the fact of you mattered. I wrote that. All of it. At 11 p.m. I stopped writing. I looked at what I had produced. Then I did 2 things. The first thing was that I copied the complete assessment database, all 53 subject files, all 11 months of documentation, including Dr. Osei's 14 months of prior documentation, including the margin notes, onto an encrypted drive that I had brought to the facility that day in my bag. Not because I had planned to do this specifically. Because I had understood since month 6 that something in the documentation needed to be preserved outside the program's control, and I had been carrying the drive for 5 months waiting to understand what specifically needed preserving. Now I understood. Everything needed preserving. Not for the program's purpose. For the subject's purpose. The 53 people who had trusted their experiences to an assessment process they believed was in service of understanding. Their accounts. Their private selves as they had been willing to share them. Their descriptions of the most significant experiences of their lives. Those belonged to them and to the record of what had happened to them, and not to an institutional purpose they had not consented to serve. I copied the database. The second thing I did was write a letter to Calloway. Not a resignation letter. Not yet. Something more specific than resignation. I told him what I knew. Not what Miriam had told me. I protected her in the letter by not naming her specifically as the source of my understanding. What I had understood from 11 months of interviews and 8 months of documentation review, and the specific clarity that had arrived in the 3 hours after my 60th session. I told him the assessment program had produced accurate and valuable documentation of a real phenomenon. I told him the subjects were not wrong. I told him the documentation was being used in a way that the subjects had not consented to, and that I could not continue producing it in service of that use. I told him that the other place existed and that what it held was real, and that the way it held what it held, with the orientation of care, because the fact of each person mattered, was not separable from what it held. That the mechanism and the mattering were not separable. That you could not have the knowing without the caring, because the knowing was a function of the caring. The presences knew every person because every person mattered to them, and the mattering was not incidental to the knowledge. It was the mechanism of it. I told him that an attempt to replicate the knowledge without the mattering was not a replication of the knowledge. It was a misunderstanding of what knowledge was. I sent the letter at midnight. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at what I had done. I had not sold anything. The program existed. It would continue to exist. Calloway would respond to my letter in whatever way he responded, and the institutional machinery would process my departure in whatever way it processed departures, and the program would find another assessor, and the work would continue in the direction it had been going. I had not stopped that. What I had done was smaller than stopping it and more durable. I had the documentation. I had the account I was writing. I had 11 months of listening to 53 people describe the most significant experiences of their lives, and I had the understanding that the listening had produced, and I had made the decision to do with that understanding what the presences in the other place did with what they held. Keep it. Because it mattered. Not because it was useful. Not because it served a program or an institution or a purpose above someone's clearance level. Because the fact of it mattered. The fact of 53 people who had been somewhere extraordinary and had tried to describe it. The specific, irreducible, unrepeatable fact of each of them. I thought about Thomas the electrician who sat in the other place and understood something about time that he could not bring back in words, but that the understanding had lived in him ever since, and that he protected from medication because if he forgot it there would be no one left who remembered. I thought about the woman who found her father and the 37-year wound removed. I thought about the marine biologist who had surfaced after 47 minutes and climbed the ladder and eaten dinner and gone to sleep, and 3 weeks later had begun knowing the people around her in the way the presences knew everyone, and had spent 14 months adjusting to the resolution of a perception that showed her the private self of every person she spent time with. I thought about the graduate student in physics who described returning from a dream where she knew the language and waking into a world where the language didn't exist and having only the grammar of the dream as evidence that the words had been real. I thought about Dr. Osei and his for margin words. They are not wrong. No, I thought. They are not wrong. They were more right than the frameworks built to assess them. More right than the program that documented them. More right than the clinical language I had spent 11 months applying to experiences that the clinical language was built too small to hold. They had been somewhere. And somewhere had known them. And the knowing was the most significant thing that had ever happened to them. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was frightening or revelatory in the lightning bolt sense. Because it was the experience of being seen completely. Of having the private self, the specific, irreducible, never fully shown self that every person carries, seen and held with care. The experience that almost no one has while living. Of being known. At 2 a.m. I closed my office computer. I picked up the encrypted drive. I picked up my bag. I walked out of the program's facility. I did not return. In the month since that night I have completed this account through the many revisions it required. I have been in contact with several of the subjects who consented to be. I have shared what I know with the people who have the standing to do something institutional with it, carefully, in the ways that are honest about the limits of what can be proven and clear about the significance of what is real. I have thought every day about the other place. Not about going there. I have not been displaced. I am not one of the subjects. What I know of the other place I know through the accounts of 53 people who described it from 53 angles and the shape that emerged from the describing. The shape is this. There is a place adjacent to everything. Foundational. Underneath. Not beside the world but beneath it in the way that the substrate of a thing is beneath the thing. In that place every person who has ever been is known. Not was known. Is known. Continuously. The knowing is not retrospective. It is present and ongoing, and it does not diminish with time because time in that place is not a line but a room, and every person who has ever been is present in the room simultaneously. Every person is held there. With the specific care of something for which the fact of each person matters not instrumentally but in itself. The presences do not keep the knowledge because it is useful. They keep it because it matters. Because you matter. Not in the abstract. Not in the category of human beings mattering in some general philosophical sense. You specifically. The private you. The one that isn't shown. The one that knows the difference between the self you present and the self that exists before and underneath the presentation. The one that has the specific texture of your particular consciousness, your memories and your hopes and your regrets and the exact quality of your experience of being alive in this body in this time. That you. That you is known. That you is held. With care. Because it matters. I did not need to go to the other place to understand this. I had 53 people tell me. And I listened. And I am telling you. Not because the telling is useful. Because it matters. Because you matter. Because someone should say it. And I am the one positioned to say it. So I am saying it. You are known. You have always been known. Whatever the private self is that you carry in the specific texture of your consciousness, whatever you have never shown and never said and never found adequate language for. It is known. It is held. With care. Because the fact of you is irreducible. And the irreducible fact of you matters. Not to a program. Not to an institution. To something foundational. Something that has always been foundational. Something that is, in the oldest and most precise meaning of the word, attending to you. Right now. As you read this. As you have always been attended to. Whether you knew it or not.